Hey, what's up, everybody? Well, hopefully this will record correctly. I think I accidentally put it on slow-mo one time, and that made me have to redo it. But real quickly, I would like to do a quick unboxing, and I know this is kind of a part 2 of my last video, but hopefully it won't be as long. But I want to unbox the item that I thought would never come in. And came in this envelope. Was supposed to come in around Friday the 13th, but instead came in Wednesday the 11th, and I made a song about her. So what she is, she's a cute little Kelly clone, basically a knockoff Kelly doll from the 90s, and I love gingham. I have a weakness for gingham and plaid. Oh, if only there were more doll clothes with tiny ginghams and plaids. Well, she's basically this company called Lucky, L-U-C-K-Y, and it's symbolic because we're gonna have a Friday the 13th, so it's like I need all the luck I can get. But Lucky was a doll company. It was one of the doll companies that sort of made clones beginning in the 80s. You know, there was Lucky, there was Kidcore, there was Totsie in the UK. There was just a few competitors, not that many. And then there was Lovely Patsy for the really cheap ones. But Lucky made a really good Kelly clone in the early days of Kelly. And what's cool about Lucky, the Lucky company, see, they had made like a Stacy that I wish I could get my hands on because it's so rare. She's slightly bigger than Mattel Stacy. But their Kelly doll is spot on. I mean, those eyes, they are, I mean, if that doesn't look like the original 94 Kelly, I don't know what would, except they're a darker blue. Kelly's eyes were more of a grayish, realistic blue, and they came in different colors, whereas these dolls pretty much unanimously had dark blue eyes, with only, I think, blonde or auburn hair to take care of brunette and redhead. They had sandy blonde and they had auburn. And there may have been, you know, other races, but I don't know. But Lucky made some Kelly dolls dating back to 94. And they look like the first, some of the earliest versions of Kelly. The 94 version. Oh, and there was, you know, there was Toy Century, and there was a few others. But these ones, oh, I hear that train, came the closest to being a Kelly that was quality made, and I like the way her skin is light. You know, Kelly had more of a tan, and she was more white-skinned. And way back in 1994, I mean, yeah, way back in 2004, when these were about 10 years old, I used to have some that I had bought at the dollar store. And what was cool about them, you see, you can tell when the clones were popular by what they tried to copy. And since the boy dolls would often come out toward the beginning of a doll line, like when it was first introduced, within a few years there would be a boy doll. Then they would unfortunately learn that the boys didn't sell as easily as the girls did. And they'd be phased out, whereas the girls would continue. And that's why I do not understand why people got so upset with me for converting little girls into boys and calling it disturbing and whatnot, because I mean, I was only doing what I had to do. And, you know, I was resorting to the things I had to do, you know, to have boys, because it was either that or just simply have only female dolls, in all but a few rare exceptions. And because it was so important, it's just a testament to how important it was to me that some dolls be boys. You know, it's not disturbing, it's just desperate. in my mind. I was just so desperate to see masculinity represented in a doll. Um, like the Veruca Salt song, Don't Care How I Want It Now. And it's like, rather than wait for the world to change, and start my own company in a fantasy world where boys would actually sell, which, newsflash, that doesn't exist and won't happen. If I wait for that, my life will end without it ever happening, because that's just not in the cards, and I didn't understand why. I just knew that it wasn't. Did not understand why I would never live in a world where boy dolls were as plentiful as girl dolls, or where starting such a company would make you money. But I knew that I was smart enough to know that it wouldn't happen, and just accept that and do what I had to do to get them, which was, unfortunately, convert little androgynous looking girls like this into boys by whatever means possible. And I think I did a pretty good job of it. I think, all things considering, I don't know how I could have done a much better job, on some of the projects that I did, other than maybe if I got some doll clay, or, used Play-Doh and Mod Podge to glue it on, and created a truly convincing, plastic look, because that's what I would have really wanted. I wish someone could have helped me work it out to where, instead of just flocking the majority of them and having some of them with curly hair, tiny curls glued on, and some of them with their original hair glued down after cutting it strategically, and, tying it down with pieces of material, kind of like a hairnet, kind of like, almost like, like a scarf that a woman would wear in the rain or something, in the cold, a kerchief, or whatever you call, a piece of material that's not a hijab, but, just something tied around their head. A lot of times they were made with that method, like the Bradley doll that I was so proud of, wherein I would either, just cut it in a very strategic, and I think it's pretty amazing. I think it shows that I should have studied cosmetology and, worked for a salon. And, it's just all just like cutting a piece of material, and knowing how it's going to come together. Same thing with hair. Cutting the hair and knowing how it's going to lay down, and how you can use glue instead of hair gel, to make it flat to the head. And I even got some composite hairstyles wherein I flocked, all around the back and the sides of the head. I think I've shown that one. And then I, I removed all the hair plugs, from here on down, kind of like a skin fade, flocked this hair, and then I, combed down this part of the hair, maybe split down the middle. I think it's called surfer curtains, and, tied that down really hard. Like, I may have even removed their head if possible, with a strip of material, with a lot of glue and hairspray to keep it down. And I mean, it just looks amazing sometimes. So I think I did the best I could to make convincing boys out of the material that I had. I mean, so anyway, that's enough talk about that. But I'm, willing to accept that this is just a girl and always will be, and I'm fine with that. She can go with my Mikey boys with their factory flocked hair if she needs to be with a boy. But I don't really intend on getting any boys. But the cool thing about the Lucky dolls is they were a knockoff company created at a time when Tommy, the boy doll, the token boy, was still popular. And so as a result, they had some version of him. That's what I thought was cool around that time. Was a lot of times the knockoff dolls, in general they don't make boys. They just don't. When it's a cheap doll, you're just not going to have boys because they know that they don't sell. And so the whole point is to be budget friendly. So, people looking for a bottom of the line doll are not looking for the token boy as a collector's item. So what they did was they knew that some kids were going to want boys, but that you cannot market them as such. And so they did strange things wherein they'd have a doll with that hairdo, just like Tommy, only slightly longer. Like Tommy with his haircut grown out. It's that same bowl cut blonde hair. And this was true with the Lovely Patsies and the Paula dolls. A few other knockoffs would have like a doll that looked very unisex or androgynous looking. I think it was even the Simba dolls had one like that. So they'd make one that sort of looked like Tommy, but it had to be marketed in such a way that it could be a girl. You know what I'm saying? Like they may not give them a name, but it was left to your imagination as to whether it was a boy or a girl. Whereas the other dolls in the series were clearly girls. And so they'd have like one unisex looking doll that looked like it could be a girl with kind of a mushroom cut blonde hair, or it could be their version of Tommy. Use your imagination, basically. Rarely was he ever, distinguished as a boy. But he could pass for one, and that's what I liked. With a hair trim, he was basically a knockoff Tommy. And so the Lucky Dolls had such a doll. They had the two, they would often sell them in pairs. And you'd have, I think they gave them names like Kendra and Kenzie. And they didn't tell you which one was which. But they were, dressed like twins with pink and blue overalls. But one of them, had long hair and braids and was in the dress version. The other one, was in kind of shorts with a mushroom cut, like a bowl cut. So it was left up to your imagination as to whether that's just a tomboy, it's just a girl distinguished from her twin sister by being a tomboy, or it could actually be a boy. They often give them unisex names like that. Like Kendra is clearly a girl, but Kenzie is normally a girl, but I guess it could be a boy. Or you could just give them your own names. So Lucky did have sort of a Tommy doll, somewhat uglier, just like the Simba boy. But he was still somewhat unisex. But what happened was, you see, I had a problem wherein I could never, in addition to not accepting them as all girls, I tried to change other things about them, and that's what I really regret. Because I hated, the lack of diversity, not only in gender, but also in size. As I've talked about before, it was either little bitty dolls like this or full-on adults. In the doll world, you were either, at that time, you were either 4-inch baby, which is unrealistic because that translates to 24 inches. And when you're 24 or 27 inches, you're only 6 to 9 months old and crawling. So they were either as short as a crawling baby who in real life wouldn't have much hair, or they were as tall as a 5'9" adult. Really Barbie's more like 5'6" without her high heels or something like that. You were either 4 inches tall, like a baby under a year old, or you were the size of an adult. And there was no middle ground for a very long time. There was just no middle ground. Um, like in the 90s, there was still Stacy, which that's why she's my favorite, because she's like smack dab in the middle of that at almost 8 inches. Um, she's like as close to the middle of that as you could get. I guess smack dab would be exactly 8 inches. And then, when there were various skippers, she was toward the higher end of that. And now Chelsea is toward the lower end of that. So that's what I really wish, is that you could that that there could be a day when they would manufacture 3-inch baby, 4.5-inch toddler, almost 6-inch Chelsea, 7.5, almost 8-inch Stacy, old-fashioned 9-inch type Skipper, 10.5-inch Skipper and Kevin, and then full-size Barbie and Ken. So it'd be like a organ pipe, going up like this, boys and girls. So yeah, that's my dream, and I've only been able to accomplish that by collecting dolls that are as old as 50 years old by now. You know what I'm saying? If I wouldn't have collected dolls dating all the way back to the 60s and all the way to the current day, when they're sort of making a comeback in the form of modern Stacy, I wouldn't be able to have that. That's what my parents never understood about this need for dolls. Because it's not just having dolls, it's having specific categories of dolls. I want to see various races. I want to see both genders. I want to see all sizes. You know what I'm saying? I don't just want it to be like the German Maidens Club, all a bunch of blonde hair, blue-eyed, tall women that are sexually mature, which is what men probably want. The League of German Maidens. And, it's just ridiculous that it was, the other people are just okay with it being that. No, I would like to see a lot more diversity. I don't really care about fatness that much. It's not really important for them to be fat, although it would, if I could control the world. I wish that there would be adolescent dolls, roughly about 9 inches tall, like right before puberty, wherein the faces of the boy and the girl are nearly identical. Nearly identical. Basically imagine a world wherein there's like a Skipper doll. Let's say she's about 9 inches, or let's say she's 8.5 inches, to sort of bridge the gap between Stacy and old-fashioned Skipper and Ricky. Let's say they're 8.5 inches. Well, I would like to see a line of dolls represent a rare, a short-lived, and rarely acknowledged stage of development, wherein the girls they would have little breasts, they would be lean and trim, and not exactly tall, but slender, okay? They would have the head size similar to an adult Barbie, or a Stacy, or a Skipper, or whatever, because, your head is 98% as big as it ever will be by the age of 7, and that's a fact. So, you'd have this new doll that I would like to, if I introduced a line of dolls. The only difference between the boy and girl doll would be that she would have a svelte, S-V-E-L-T-E, like a slender look about her with small breasts and hips, like a slightly hourglass figure, small hands and small feet. Well, guess what would be the only difference between her and the boy version? He would be slightly shorter, not taller like Kent, not taller. Okay, so they would have flat feet, but the boy, instead of the girl, instead of being exactly the same size, instead of, the Ken being slightly taller, despite Barbie's high heels, the boy would be slightly shorter, though not by much. Like the girl, let's say she'd be about 8 3/4 inches. Well, the boy in my fantasy line would be 8.5 or 8.6. Like she might be 8.75, he might be 8.6. So it'd be a very subtle difference, like less than 1/4 of an inch, representing an inch in real life. And so the difference between his body and her body, they would have the same neck size. Well, his body would be shorter, stockier, and have like a barrel shape about it. So instead of being, curvy and small waist, he would just be kind of like a pudgy, not an obese kid, but just a pudgy, barrel-shaped kid like this. And she would just be like, more trim and slightly taller. And his hands and feet would be slightly bigger. So yeah, that would be my doll design. The stage of development, then that's roughly in real life translates to about 11 or 12 years old, like the 6th grade. Right before puberty, when the girls are further along into puberty, and the boys, they certainly aren't far into it. Yeah, but I mean, realistically, they always seem to make the boy taller. If there's a difference, people are kind of in denial that that stage ever happens in real life, even though the averages tell us that, that in all but one brief, short-lived period of time, and it's roughly middle school, all other parts of the lifespan, the boys are slightly taller on average to much taller. Like, before the age of 10, the boys were slightly taller, within an inch, than the girls. After the age of 13 or 14, they become much taller, like as much as 5 or 6 inches taller than women. But for a brief period of time, roughly 10 to 12, they're less than an inch shorter than girls. So it's like the blue line briefly dips below the pink line. And you'll see that on any growth chart. And it's like that. Think with weight, but not by as much. Because they're still, like I said, they're short and stocky. They're short and stocky, and they could have man boobs, but, that doesn't need to be represented. But yeah, boys kind of go through a stage where they look short and stocky in comparison to the girls. And, so yeah, I mean, I'll never forget, that stage of development. I know this video has gone along. And I can remember, like, I've talked about being red-shirted. And what that means, it's not a literal term, but I was put in school a year late, later than most people would have put their kids with my birth date. And it had a lot to do with things I've talked about. My mom just not being ready to put me in school more than anything for various reasons. I just wish I'd been homeschooled altogether, because that school did not fit my needs. And I have nothing but bad memories from going there. And so yeah, what I was saying, this is a lucky doll, so I'm just not going to buy the boy because he's not enough of a difference. But anyway, so what I want to talk about, I remember that stage of development wherein I have a cousin who is, I want to say exactly 63 weeks younger than I am. So because he's a year younger than me, and I'm not exactly petite, he's not really petite, he's just average, and, well, I guess we were both average. But, so because he was about 14 months younger than me, that canceled out him being taller than me from being a boy. So, there's a bigger difference, with children that are 1 year older than gender, when they're younger. Because the gender difference isn't really that much until they're much older. So my cousin, because he was a full year, a little bit over a year younger than me, he had always been shorter than me by a little bit. My first decade of life, he was shorter than me, but he was also pudgy. So he might have weighed more than me or the same amount. Because I've never really had a huge appetite. Whereas, these boys in my family, some of them can really eat. Sort of like my dad. And so this boy cousin, we were similar in size with me being slightly taller. First decade of life. Well, as I've stated before, I was redshirted, meaning I really should have graduated in 2001. And this cousin of mine, he graduated the same year I did, so we both graduated in 2002. But it's really, he should have graduated in 2003 because he was the opposite. When I see people suggesting you redshirt the boys only, well, in our family, it was the other way around. I was redshirted, because I was a girl with attention deficit. And, so I was held out of school an extra year. So I went to kindergarten at 6. Well, this cousin of mine, because he lived in this state where their cutoff is a month later, see, if he'd been in Texas with me, he would have been made to wait another year because of his birthday. You see, in Texas, as I've stated before, the youngest people are August 31st, whereas over here it's September the 30th. So, because he was in this state and he was born in September, early September, he could have actually been almost a month younger and still gone to school while he was still technically 4, near the beginning of kindergarten for almost a month or so, or however long. It wasn't very long, but he was age X minus 1 at the beginning of every school year. And I was age X plus 1 for most of the school year until some of my classmates would have birthdays. So I was older than most kids despite being a girl, and he was younger than most kids despite being a boy. And, so it was embarrassing just how similarly we were performing in school in spite of that. But where it showed up was in height for a very brief period of time. So when I got into puberty, I want to say it started at 9, but then I didn't get a period till I was almost 12. And so when I was between the ages of roughly 10 and 13 or 14, I was clearly taller than him, peaking in the 6th grade. So I may have been as much as 2 or 3 inches taller than this cousin when we were 6th graders. And then the gap began to close, just like on the growth chart. And of course, by high school, by the time we were juniors, or I want to say sophomores, was the first time I saw him in high school. It's a long story. I think his final height was around 5'9" or so, and mine is a little shy of 5'4". So that's about 5 inches, just like the average man and woman. So, it definitely flipped around. But, I'll never forget, it was like just a mind freak, to put it nicely. So yeah, it's like he started to go through the voice change when we were in the 8th grade, but really he should have been in the 7th grade, and I should have been in high school, chronologically. And it started out, it wasn't a drastic change. It was like he kind of had a deeper version of the voice he'd always had as a little boy. He was like 13 years, 4 months or so. And I'm like, what's going on with your voice? It was like, I don't know, it was just, gradually deepening each time I would see him, but still not a man's voice. But he got to a point where it was squeaky, I guess that'd be like 10 or 3. And it was starting to squeak when he'd go up into the high range or get mad about something. And it had never been that squeaky. And he didn't have a cold or anything. And I asked his mom even, and it kind of embarrassed him, what's going on with his voice. And she told me it's puberty. Um, and so he was like 13 and a half almost, and I was 14 and a half. And I noticed that the height difference, like I was still a little bit, maybe an inch taller than him, but not as much as when we'd been in the 6th grade. Like the gap had closed, and we were almost the same height for a brief period. But unfortunately, my mom, it's a long story, she just didn't come to her hometown anymore for 1 year at least, or no, it was actually 2 years that I didn't see this boy. Our freshman year and most of the sophomore year. So he was 13 and a half then. So the whole year he was 14, and then most of the year he was 15. I didn't see him at all, but I was informed by my grandmother, because she came over to our house and we saw her that summer, that his voice was sounding very different, like a really deep, manly voice. And he probably had the earliest voice change out of all my cousins, but he had a really deep voice all of a sudden, since some point in the freshman year when he'd have been about 14 and a half. And that sometimes it scared her because she forgot that he looked and sounded like a grown man. And so then the next time I saw him was almost a year after that, when he was 15 and a half, and it's like he was not the same person I remembered at all. Like he had a grown man's voice. He was now taller than me for the first time in our lives. And he was meaner than ever. And he was just very intimidating. I'd never experienced that before, being afraid of my slightly younger cousin as a mind freak. Pardon my French. So yeah, I felt that way, and I felt the same way about all my male classmates. Every one of them, every beginning of the school year, I'd go home and cry myself to sleep because I'd be like, Mama, so-and-so's voice changed over the summer. And then when I got to high school, it went from like slightly less than half to the vast majority, between 8th and 9th grade. That was the summer with the most changes. And as I stated before, the unchanged ones just went down exponentially every semester. Less than half as many would remain, beginning at 14. So yeah, until none remained by the time we got to college. So yeah, this video's gone on way too long, but yeah, that's why I wrote that song, how I never, ever, ever, I never looked forward to being a teenager when I was a kid. It angers me so much when people say that kids long to be teens and teens long to be adults. Well, absolutely not. I never, ever, ever longed to enter the next stage of development. And, after this boy cousin, his little brother changed a few years later at a similar age. And then the other little boys in the family all changed around the same age, maybe a little later, 14, 15. One of them changed around 16, like Justin Bieber. And, one by one, it's like it did not make me happy. Adolescence and adulthood did not bring happiness for me. And the most depressing decade of my whole lifespan was ages 10 through 19, when I just gradually, came to accept that, hey, I was going to be stuck as a woman. I would never exceed 5'4". I would never have the voice I dreamed of having without some drastic intervention that you know about what it would be. And it would F up my life in so many other ways that my voice would be the least of my concern. So yeah, it did not make me happy, to go from part of my lifespan where I was taller than most people, regardless of gender, just because I was red-shirted, to suddenly, almost all men, nearly all men, and a few women are taller than me. And I'm just stuck, in an adult woman's body. So I'll go ahead and post this video.